The man who opened the door was 70 if he was a day, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, confusion spreading across his pale face like morning fog. I stood there with my phone in my hand, Sierra's location pin glowing on the screen, and watched him try to understand why a stranger half his age was on his doorstep at 9:30 on a Wednesday night. The hallway behind him smelled like roasted chicken and lavender candles, the kind of domestic comfort that made my stomach turn because I recognized the scent from our apartment. Sierra appeared behind him, her face going from relaxed to frozen in the span of a heartbeat, and I saw everything I needed to see in that single moment of recognition. She wasn't visiting a sick relative or helping a friend or any of the dozen lies I'd have convinced myself might be true when I clicked on that location tracker we'd installed for safety after her car broke down last year. The wedding band on her left hand caught the porch light, and it wasn't the one I'd given her 3 years ago. My name is Josh, and this is my revenge story. But before we continue, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. It really helps me bring you more stories. The old man looked between us, his watery blue eyes trying to connect dots that didn't want to connect, and Sierra stepped forward with her hand out like she could physically stop what was already happening. I'd driven 40 minutes from our place in Round Rock to this upscale condominium complex in West Austin, my mind running through every possible explanation except the one that was now staring me in the face with perfect, terrible clarity. The business trips she'd started taking every other week, the new clothes she bought with cash, the way she'd grown distant in bed but affectionate in public, all of it suddenly made the kind of sense that breaks something fundamental inside a man. She said my name, soft and pleading, but I was already looking past her into the living room where I could see 2 plates on the dining table, 2 wine glasses, a life she'd built in the spaces between our life. The old man cleared his throat and asked if there was a problem, his voice reedy and uncertain, and I realized he had no idea who I was or that the woman he'd married 3 months ago was already married to someone else. I didn't shout or push past them or make a scene in the hallway where neighbors might hear. I took out my phone and snapped a photo of the 2 of them standing there in the doorway, her hand still on his arm, both of them wearing the kind of guilt that can't be hidden or explained away. Sierra's eyes went wide and she started to say something about me not understanding, about it being complicated, but I was already turning away and walking back toward the elevator with a calmness that surprised even me. The photo was insurance, evidence, proof that I wasn't crazy or paranoid or imagining things in the dark. I could hear her footsteps behind me, heels clicking on the tile, her voice rising with each step as she tried to call me back, but the elevator doors opened and I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. The last thing I saw before the doors closed was her face, pale and desperate, and behind her the old man still standing in his doorway trying to understand what storm had just blown through his quiet evening. The drive back to Round Rock felt longer than the drive there, my hands steady on the wheel, but my mind racing through 3 years of memories that needed to be re-examined and reframed. We'd met at a community college where she was taking business classes and I was finishing my associate degree in information technology, both of us working full-time and grinding toward something better. She'd seemed ambitious and focused, the kind of woman who knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to work for it, and I'd fallen for that drive as much as for her smile. Now I understood that her ambition had a darker edge to it, a willingness to use people as stepping stones toward whatever goal she'd set for herself. The old man was clearly well off, judging by the neighborhood and the furnishings I'd glimpsed in that brief moment at the door, and Sierra had always been the type to notice who had money and who didn't. I thought we were building something together, pooling our resources and planning for a future that included a house and maybe kids and all the ordinary dreams that ordinary people chase. Instead, she'd been running a long con, and I'd been too trusting or too stupid to see it. I parked in our apartment complex lot and sat in the darkness for a long time, trying to decide what to do next. The rational part of my brain said to call a lawyer in the morning, file for divorce, split our minimal assets and move on with my life. The angry part wanted to expose her to everyone we knew, blast that photo across social media and watch her reputation burn. But there was a third part, quieter and colder that wanted to understand the full scope of what she'd done before I made any moves at all. If she'd married that old man 3 months ago, she'd committed bigamy, which was a crime. If she was stealing from him, which seemed likely given the age gap and the secrecy, that was another crime. And if she'd forged documents or lied on official paperwork, those were more crimes stacking up like dominoes waiting to fall. I pulled out my phone and started searching for information on the condominium complex, the units that had sold recently, anything that might give me a name to attach to the confused face I'd seen in that doorway. It took less than 20 minutes to find him. Harold Westbrook, 72 years old, retired petroleum engineer, widower for 5 years, living in a 2-bedroom condo he'd purchased 18 months ago for just under $500,000. His late wife's obituary mentioned 2 adult children living out of state in California and Oregon, which probably explained why no one had noticed him being courted by a woman 40 years his junior. I found his LinkedIn profile, inactive for 3 years, and a mention in a church newsletter about a generous donation he'd made to their building fund. Sierra had found herself a lonely widower with money and no local family to ask uncomfortable questions, and she'd moved in like a heat-seeking missile. The marriage license would be public record, which meant I could prove she was a bigamist with a single trip to the county clerk's office. The question was whether I wanted to destroy her immediately or whether I wanted to dig deeper and find out just how much damage she'd really done. My phone buzzed with a text from Sierra. "Please come back. We need to talk. I can explain everything." I stared at those words for a long moment, thinking about all the times she'd said she loved me, all the nights we'd spent planning our future, all the small kindnesses I'd done for her because I thought we were partners in this life. Then I blocked her number and opened a notes app to start documenting everything I knew: dates, times, locations, the photo I'd taken, the information I'd found about Harold. If she wanted to play games with people's lives and hearts, she was about to learn that some people play back and some people play to win. I wasn't going to be the fool who got conned and walked away with nothing but bruises and bitter memories. I went to work the next morning like nothing had happened, clocking in at the IT support center where I'd been employed for 2 years and settling into my cubicle with my coffee and my game face firmly in place. My coworker Devin asked if I was all right because I was quieter than usual, and I told him I'd had a rough night's sleep, which wasn't a lie. I'd spent most of the night lying awake in our bed, listening to Sierra's key turn in the lock around 2 in the morning and her footsteps pause outside the bedroom door before retreating to the couch. We hadn't spoken, hadn't made eye contact, and I'd left for work before she woke up, keeping everything normal on the surface while my mind worked through the angles underneath. The beauty of working in IT is that no one questions you spending hours on a computer, and I used my lunch break to pull Sierra's credit report using a service we'd signed up for together when we were trying to improve our scores. The report showed 3 credit cards I'd never seen, all opened in the last 6 months, with balances totaling nearly $40,000. There were also charges to high-end boutiques, restaurants I couldn't afford, and a jewelry store that made my jaw clench when I saw the amount. She'd been living a whole separate life on credit, probably telling Harold she needed help with business expenses or family emergencies while using his money to pay down the minimums. I screenshot everything and saved it to a cloud drive she didn't know about, building my case piece by piece. My phone showed 17 missed calls from her number before I'd blocked it, and when I checked my email there were 5 messages ranging from apologetic to angry to desperate. I deleted them all without reading past the first lines. At 3 in the afternoon, I drove to the Travis County Clerk's office and requested a copy of the marriage license for Sierra Michelle Cole and Harold James Westbrook, dated 3 months prior. The clerk barely glanced at me as she processed the request. Just another piece of paperwork in a system that churned out documents all day long. The license listed Sierra's marital status as single, which was perjury, and her signature matched the one I'd seen on our lease renewal last month. I paid the $7 fee and walked out with legal proof that my wife was a bigamist, and the weight of that document in my hand felt like power condensing into something solid and real. I sat in my truck in the parking lot and called a lawyer whose name I'd found through a quick search for divorce attorneys who offered free consultations. The lawyer's name was Patricia Odom, and she had an office in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. She was a black woman in her 50s with short natural hair and reading glasses on a chain, and she listened to my story without interrupting while making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle that told me everything I needed to know about how bad this situation really was. She explained that bigamy was a third-degree felony in Texas, punishable by up to 10 years in prison, and that I could file for an annulment rather than a divorce since our marriage was legally void from the moment she married Harold. The credit card debt was trickier because some of it might be considered community property depending on when it was incurred, but the fraud charges she might be facing would complicate everything. Patricia asked me what I wanted to do, whether I wanted to press charges or just get out clean, and I told her I wasn't sure yet because I was still gathering information. I drove back to the apartment that evening and found Sierra's car gone, her clothes missing from the closet, and a note on the kitchen counter written in her precise handwriting. The note said she was staying with a friend and needed space to think, which almost made me laugh because she'd had plenty of space to think when she was marrying another man and running up 40 grand in secret debt. I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, then started going through the apartment systematically, looking for anything else she might have hidden. I found a second phone in a shoebox at the back of her side of the closet, an iPhone I'd never seen before with a cracked screen and a dead battery. I plugged it in and waited for it to boot up, my heart beating faster because I knew this was going to show me things I probably didn't want to see. The phone came to life and the lock screen showed a photo of Sierra and Harold on what looked like a beach vacation, both of them smiling like newlyweds without a care in the world. I tried her birthday as the passcode and got in on the first attempt, which told me she wasn't quite as clever as she thought she was. The messages were a goldmine of evidence. Conversations with Harold about our future together, and, finally being happy again after losing Margaret, texts to a woman named Jasmine about how easy it was to manipulate lonely old men, and a group chat with 3 other women where they shared tips on finding wealthy targets. I read through months of messages, my disgust growing with each revelation, until I understood that Sierra wasn't just a woman who'd made a bad choice or gotten caught up in something bigger than herself. She was a predator who'd made a lifestyle out of exploiting vulnerable people. One message chain stood out from the rest, dated 2 weeks before she married Harold. Sierra had written to Jasmine, "Found the perfect mark. Widower, loaded, no family nearby. Should be good for at least $200K before I need to move on. T doesn't suspect anything, still thinks we're saving for a house." Jasmine had responded with laughing emojis and congratulations, followed by advice about keeping me around as a backup plan in case things went south with Harold. The casual cruelty of it hit me harder than I expected, the realization that I'd been nothing more than a safety net in her calculations, a placeholder she could return to if her real plans fell through. I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared and felt something cold and final settle into my chest where love used to live. I spent the rest of the evening forwarding every message, photo, and email from that phone to my secure cloud drive, creating a digital paper trail that would be admissible in court if it came to that. Then I did something that surprised even me. I sent a carefully worded message to Harold's phone number, which I'd found in Sierra's contacts. The message introduced me as Josh Cole, explained that I was legally married to the woman he knew as Sierra, and suggested we meet somewhere public to discuss our mutual problem. I didn't expect him to respond. Figured he might think it was a scam or some kind of shakedown, but 15 minutes later my phone buzzed with a reply. "Coffee shop on 6th Street tomorrow at 10. Come alone." And just like that, the game changed from me versus Sierra to me and Harold versus the woman who'd tried to destroy us both. Harold Westbrook looked smaller and frailer in the daylight of the coffee shop than he had in his doorway 2 nights before, his hands shaking slightly as he wrapped them around a mug of black coffee. I'd arrived 10 minutes early and chosen a table in the back corner where we could talk without being overheard, and when he walked in I could see the weight of the last 48 hours in the way he carried himself. We shook hands like 2 men meeting to discuss a business deal neither of us wanted, and for a long moment we just sat there in silence, both of us trying to figure out how to start a conversation that shouldn't need to happen. He spoke first, his voice quiet but steady, telling me that Sierra had moved out of his condo the morning after I'd shown up and hadn't answered any of his calls since then. She'd taken jewelry he'd given her, some cash he kept in a desk drawer, and apparently maxed out a credit card he'd added her to for emergencies. The police had told him that without more evidence of intent to defraud, it would be hard to press charges, and he seemed more heartbroken than angry about the whole situation. I showed him the marriage license that proved Sierra and I were legally married 3 years before she'd married him, and I watched his face crumble as the reality of what she'd done fully sank in. He'd genuinely believed she loved him, he said. Believed that after 5 lonely years following his wife Margaret's death, he'd found someone who could make him feel alive again. Sierra had been attentive and affectionate, interested in his stories about the oil business and his time in Vietnam, never pushing for money but accepting gifts graciously when he offered them. He'd proposed after 6 months of dating, eager to lock down this unexpected happiness before it could slip away, and she'd said yes without hesitation. The wedding had been small, just them and 2 witnesses at the courthouse, because she'd said she didn't want a big fuss and he'd been too smitten to question why she didn't want any of her family there. Now, he understood it was because she couldn't risk anyone from her real life finding out about her fake one. I told him about the second phone, the messages to Jasmine and the other women, the evidence that Sierra was part of a network of people who targeted vulnerable men with money. Harold's hands clenched around his coffee mug hard enough that I worried it might shatter, but when he spoke, his voice was still controlled. He said his children had warned him about moving too fast with someone so much younger, but he'd been insulted by their implications and had insisted Sierra was different from the gold diggers they were imagining. He'd planned to put her in his will, had already started the paperwork with his lawyer to ensure she'd be taken care of if anything happened to him. I could see the shame in his eyes as he admitted how close he'd come to handing over everything he'd worked for to a woman who'd been planning to bleed him dry and disappear. We sat there in that coffee shop like 2 survivors of the same shipwreck, comparing notes on how we'd been fooled and trying to figure out what came next. Harold asked me what I wanted to do about Sierra, whether I was planning to press charges or just walk away and let her self-destruct. I told him I'd already consulted with a lawyer about getting an annulment, and that I could provide evidence for a bigamy charge if he wanted to pursue criminal prosecution. He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee like the answers might be floating in there somewhere, and when he finally looked up, his eyes had a hardness I hadn't seen before. He said he wanted justice, wanted to make sure she couldn't do this to anyone else, but he also didn't want the humiliation of a public trial where his adult children would have to watch him explain how he'd been conned. I understood that impulse toward privacy, toward handling things quietly so the whole world didn't get to see your pain and stupidity laid out for entertainment. We made an agreement right there. We'd pool our evidence and hire a private investigator to find out if there were other victims, other men Sierra and her network had targeted, and then we'd decide whether to go to the police or handle things another way. The private investigator was a woman named Rochelle Banks who operated out of a 1-room office downtown and had a reputation for being thorough and discreet. I'd found her through Patricia Odom, who said Rochelle had helped with several family law cases that needed extra documentation. Rochelle was probably 60, with copper-colored locks and a no-nonsense demeanor that inspired confidence, and when Harold and I sat down in her office and explained the situation, she barely blinked. She said she'd seen cases like this before, usually involving younger women targeting older men through dating apps and social clubs, and that the challenge was always proving intent to defraud rather than just bad relationship decisions. I gave her copies of everything I'd found on Sierra's second phone, and Harold provided bank statements showing the cash withdrawals and credit card charges that had started the day after their wedding. Rochelle said she'd need a week to dig into Sierra's background and see what else came up. I went back to my apartment and my job and my normal life, except nothing felt normal anymore because I was living in the shell of a relationship that had been hollow all along. Sierra texted me from a new number, asking if we could talk and work things out, promising she could explain everything if I'd just give her a chance. I didn't respond, just screenshot the messages and added them to my evidence file. Devin at work asked if I was going through something because I'd been distant and distracted, and I told him I was dealing with some personal issues but would be fine. The truth was, I felt like I was walking through fog, going through the motions while my real self was somewhere else entirely, calculating and planning and waiting for Rochelle to give me ammunition I could use. 5 days after our first meeting, Rochelle called and asked me and Harold to come back to her office. The look on her face when we arrived told me she'd found something significant, and when we sat down, she spread out a folder full of documents and photographs that painted a picture even uglier than I'd imagined. Sierra's real name was Sierra Lawson, and she'd been married and divorced twice before she met me, both times to men over 60, both marriages lasting less than a year. She had warrants out in 2 other states for fraud and identity theft, and there were at least 4 other men who'd filed police reports claiming she'd stolen from them after romantic relationships. The woman, named Jasmine in the text messages, was her cousin, and together they'd been running variations of this scam for at least 7 years, moving from state to state whenever things got too hot. Rochelle had photos of Sierra with different hair colors and styles, using different last names, always with the same pattern of targeting lonely older men with assets and no close family watching. Harold sat very still as Rochelle walked us through the evidence, and I could see something breaking and reforming in him, grief transforming into anger, shame hardening into resolve. He asked Rochelle if this was enough to put Sierra in prison, and she said it was more than enough if we coordinated with law enforcement in the other jurisdictions where she had warrants. But there was a complication. Sierra had disappeared. She wasn't at any of her known addresses, her phone was off, and none of her usual contacts seemed to know where she'd gone. Rochelle suspected she'd figured out that people were looking into her background and had decided to run rather than face the consequences. The question now was whether we wanted to help find her or let the authorities handle it and move on with our lives. Harold looked at me across Rochelle's desk, and I saw in his eyes the same thing I felt burning in my chest. This wasn't over until we said it was over. The police detective assigned to Sierra's case was a tired-looking man named Martinez, who worked out of the Austin Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit and seemed underwhelmed by our story until we started showing him the evidence. Rochelle had compiled everything into a presentation that would make a prosecutor salivate. The bigamy, the identity theft, the pattern of fraud across multiple states, the text messages proving conspiracy and intent. Martinez sat up straighter in his chair as he flipped through the pages, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions, and by the end of the meeting he was treating Harold and me like star witnesses instead of just 2 more victims in a system that saw dozens of fraud cases every week. He said he'd coordinate with the other jurisdictions and get warrants issued, but he was honest about the chances of actually catching Sierra if she'd gone underground. Women like her knew how to disappear, how to create new identities and find new targets, and without a lucky break or a mistake on her part, she could stay gone for years. I went back to work and tried to focus on actual productivity instead of refreshing my email every 10 minutes waiting for updates from Martinez or Rochelle. My supervisor had noticed my distraction and called me in for a check-in, asking if everything was okay at home and whether I needed to take some personal time. I almost laughed at the question because I didn't have a home anymore, just an apartment full of furniture and memories that belonged to a version of myself I didn't recognize. I told him I was going through a divorce, and he nodded sympathetically, said he'd been through one himself a few years back and knew how it could mess with your head. He offered me 2 weeks off if I needed it, and I took him up on it because I had the vacation time saved and I couldn't stand sitting in that cubicle pretending everything was fine when my whole life was being reconstructed from the ground up. During those 2 weeks, I did something I'd been avoiding since the night I knocked on Harold's door. I called my mother and told her what had happened. She lived in Houston with my stepfather, and we talked maybe once a month, usually surface-level conversations about work and whether I was eating right. She'd met Sierra twice, at Thanksgiving the year we got married, and at a family barbecue the summer after, and both times she'd been polite but distant in that way mothers get when they don't quite trust their son's choice of partner. Now, hearing the full story, She was quiet for a long time before saying she'd known something was off about Sierra but hadn't wanted to interfere in my life. The words stung because part of me wanted to ask why she hadn't said something, hadn't warned me, but I knew it wouldn't have mattered. I'd been in love, or what I thought was love, and I wouldn't have listened to anyone telling me I was being played. My mother asked if I needed money or a place to stay, and I told her I was fine financially but might come visit for a few days just to get out of Austin and clear my head. She said I was always welcome, and there was warmth in her voice that I hadn't heard in years, the kind of maternal concern that only comes out when your child is genuinely hurting. I drove to Houston that weekend with nothing but a duffel bag and my laptop, and spent 3 days eating my stepfather's cooking and sleeping in my old room and pretending I was 20 again instead of 31 and starting over. My mother didn't push me to talk about Sierra, just let me exist in her house like a place of refuge, and by the time I drove back to Austin on Sunday evening, I felt steadier than I had in weeks. Rochelle called on Tuesday morning with news that shifted everything again. She'd been monitoring Sierra's known email addresses and social media accounts, most of which had been dormant since she disappeared, when one of them showed activity. Sierra had logged into an old Facebook account from an IP address in San Antonio and posted a photo of herself at a riverside restaurant, looking relaxed and happy with a margarita in her hand. The caption said something about new beginnings and fresh starts, and Rochelle said it was either monumentally stupid or deliberately provocative, like Sierra was testing whether anyone was still watching. I felt a surge of anger looking at that photo, seeing her smile like she hadn't destroyed multiple lives and was just out enjoying a Tuesday afternoon without consequences. Rochelle had already forwarded the information to Detective Martinez, and he'd contacted San Antonio PD to see if they could locate her before she disappeared again. Harold called me that evening, and we met at the same coffee shop where we'd first sat down together, this time as something closer to friends than strangers bonded by shared trauma. He'd seen the Facebook post, too, and his hands shook as he showed me his phone screen with Sierra's smiling face filling it. He said he'd been having nightmares about her, dreams where she came back and tried to convince him it had all been a misunderstanding, and he'd wake up confused about whether he missed her or hated her or both. I understood that feeling completely because I'd had my own version of those dreams, nights where Sierra would appear and explain everything and I'd forgive her and we'd go back to how things were before. The rational part of me knew those dreams were just my brain trying to process the grief of losing something that never really existed. But the emotional part still wanted to believe there was a version of this story where she loved me and made a terrible mistake instead of never loving me at all. We talked about what would happen if the police actually caught her, whether we'd have to testify in court and relive all of this in front of a jury and judge. Harold said his lawyer had advised him to prepare for that possibility, and that his adult children had finally reached out after he'd told them what happened. They were angry he hadn't listened to their warnings, but also concerned and supportive in the way adult children get when they realize their parent is vulnerable and aging. His daughter was flying in from California the following week to help him sort through the financial mess Sierra had left behind, and his son had offered to hire a forensic accountant to trace where all the money had gone. I could hear relief in Harold's voice when he talked about his kids being involved, like he'd been carrying a weight alone and now had help bearing it. I told him about my conversation with my mother, about how I was starting to rebuild some family connections that had frayed over the years I'd been focused on Sierra and our supposed future together. Harold nodded and said that was the silver lining in all of this, that sometimes you had to lose everything to understand what actually mattered. We sat there drinking coffee and watching the evening traffic on 6th Street. Two men from different generations who'd been targeted by the same woman and had somehow ended up on the same side of a fight we never asked for. The waitress came by to refill our cups, and Harold thanked her with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed to come from a different era. And I thought about how easy it must have been for Sierra to charm him when he was still raw from grief and desperate for connection. That's when I saw her, across the street, walking past the coffee shop window with a man I didn't recognize, her hand in his like she didn't have a care in the world. I was out of my seat before I consciously decided to move, Harold calling my name behind me as I pushed through the coffee shop door and onto the sidewalk. Sierra hadn't seen me yet, too focused on the man beside her who looked to be in his 50s with gray temples and expensive clothes, the same type she'd targeted before. They were walking toward a parking garage half a block down, and I kept my distance while pulling out my phone to call Detective Martinez and tell him exactly where his fugitive was located. My hands were shaking with adrenaline and rage, but my voice came out calm and clear as I gave the address and description, Martinez telling me to stay back and let the responding officers handle it. I ignored that advice and kept following, Harold catching up to me with surprising speed for a man his age, both of us moving like we'd coordinated this instead of acting on pure instinct. Sierra and her companion stopped at a silver Mercedes, and I watched him open the passenger door for her with the same gallant gesture I'd used when we first started dating. She was wearing a blue dress I'd never seen before, and her hair was styled differently, lighter highlights framing her face, and I realized she'd already started transforming into someone new for whoever this man was. The Mercedes pulled out of the parking garage, and I sprinted back to my truck with Harold following, neither of us discussing whether we should be doing this because the answer was obvious. I started the engine and pulled into traffic 3 cars behind the Mercedes, keeping it in sight while trying not to be obvious about tailing them. Harold was on his phone calling Rochelle and giving her updates on our location, his voice tight with tension but steady. We followed the Mercedes through downtown Austin and onto I-35 heading north, the evening traffic thick enough to provide cover but not so heavy we'd lose them. Sierra's new target drove like someone who'd never had to worry about getting pulled over, smooth and confident in the fast lane, and I matched his speed while staying far enough back that they wouldn't notice my truck. Harold asked what the plan was when we caught up to them, and I realized I didn't have a plan beyond not letting Sierra disappear again. Martinez had said units were being dispatched, but Austin traffic meant it could be 20 minutes before anyone got close, and 20 minutes was enough time for her to slip away if she realized she was being followed. I told Harold we'd figure it out when we got there, wherever there turned out to be. The Mercedes took the exit for Round Rock, which made my stomach clench because that was my neighborhood, my territory, and I wondered if Sierra was deliberately leading us somewhere or if it was just coincidence. They pulled into the parking lot of an upscale apartment complex I'd driven past 100 times, the kind of place with a pool and a gym and rent that would have been out of my range when I was married to her. I parked across the street and watched them get out of the car, Sierra laughing at something the man said and touching his arm in that way she had of making you feel like the most interesting person in the world. They walked toward the entrance of Building 3, and I made a decision that probably wasn't smart but felt necessary in a way I couldn't explain. I got out of the truck and crossed the parking lot with Harold right behind me, and we reached the building entrance just as the man was punching in the security code. He looked startled when I stepped up behind him, and Sierra's face went from surprise to recognition to fear in the space of a heartbeat. The man asked if he could help us, his tone friendly but confused, and I told him he could start by asking the woman he was with what her real name was and whether she'd mentioned being wanted by the police in multiple states. Sierra tried to interject, her voice high and tight, saying I was her crazy ex who was stalking her, but Harold cut her off by introducing himself as her other husband and watching the color drain from the man's face. The man stepped back from Sierra like she'd suddenly become radioactive, and I could see him processing the information and trying to decide if this was real or some kind of elaborate prank. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photo I'd taken that first night at Harold's door, then the marriage license I kept a copy of, then a screenshot of Detective Martinez's contact information at APD. The man's name was Richard something, he said, and he'd met Sierra on a dating app 2 weeks ago and she'd told him she was a widow who'd recently moved to Austin to start fresh. He looked sick as he scrolled through the evidence on my phone, and Sierra started backing away toward the parking lot, her face a mask of calculation as she looked for an escape route. That's when the police cars pulled into the lot with lights flashing but sirens off, 2 officers getting out and approaching us with hands near their belts but not on their weapons. Martinez must have called ahead and given them our descriptions because they nodded at Harold and me before focusing on Sierra, who'd stopped moving and was now standing very still with her hands visible and her expression completely blank. One officer asked if she was Sierra Lawson, and she nodded, and they read her rights while putting her in handcuffs with a gentleness that seemed almost absurd given what she'd done. Richard was asking what was happening, his voice bewildered and angry, and Harold took him aside to explain while I watched the officers put Sierra in the back of the patrol car. She looked at me through the window, her eyes meeting mine, and I waited to feel something like satisfaction or victory or closure. Instead, I just felt tired, like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down left me empty instead of relieved. The officers said we'd need to come to the station and give statements, that Detective Martinez wanted to talk to all of us about the case they were building. Harold came back over and put a hand on my shoulder, an almost fatherly gesture from a man I'd known less than 2 weeks, and said we'd gotten her. I nodded and watched the patrol car pull away, taking Sierra toward consequences she'd been dodging for years, and tried to figure out what came next now that this chapter was finally closing. The police station was fluorescent bright and bureaucratically slow, processing and paperwork stretching what should have been a simple statement into 3 hours of waiting and repeating the same information to different people. Harold sat beside me in the hallway outside Martinez's office, both of us drinking bad coffee from a vending machine and watching other victims of other crimes file through with the same shell-shocked expressions we probably wore. Richard, the Mercedes driver, had given his statement and left, but not before apologizing to Harold and me like he'd somehow been complicit in Sierra's schemes instead of just another target she hadn't had time to fully exploit. Martinez finally called us in together, his small office packed with file boxes and a whiteboard covered in names and dates that I assumed were other cases he was juggling. He told us that Sierra was being held without bond due to the outstanding warrants from other states, and that the district attorney was coordinating with prosecutors in Colorado and New Mexico to determine which jurisdiction would try her first. The evidence we'd provided was solid enough to guarantee convictions on multiple counts, Martinez said, and between the bigamy charges, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy, Sierra was looking at serious prison time. He thanked us for our cooperation and said we'd be notified when the trial dates were set, but that we should try to move forward with our lives in the meantime. I wanted to ask how exactly I was supposed to do that, how I was meant to just flip a switch and stop feeling betrayed and foolish, but I knew Martinez had heard that question from 1,000 other victims and didn't have any better answer than time and therapy. Harold and I walked out of the station into the cool night air, and he offered to buy me a real drink at a bar he knew near his condo. We ended up at a quiet place with dark wood and low lighting, the kind of establishment where men Harold's age felt comfortable, and men my age felt like we were playing dress-up in our father's clothes. He ordered scotch and I got bourbon, and we sat at the bar not talking for a long time, just processing everything that had happened in the span of a few hours. The bartender was an older black man with kind eyes who seemed to understand we weren't there for conversation, just refilling our glasses when they got low and leaving us to our thoughts. Harold finally broke the silence by saying he'd been thinking about his late wife Margaret and how she would have seen through Sierra immediately, how she'd always been able to read people in a way he never could. I told him about Sierra's text messages on that second phone, the ones where she'd called him a mark and calculated how much she could take before moving on, and I watched him absorb that information with a kind of grim acceptance. He said he'd spent the last week wondering if any of it had been real, if she'd felt anything genuine for him even while she was running her con, and now he had his answer. The bartender brought us water without being asked, and Harold drank half the glass before saying that his daughter was arriving from California tomorrow, and he'd have to explain all of this to her face to face. I asked if he was worried about what she'd think, and he said she'd be angry that he'd ignored her warnings, but hopefully relieved that it hadn't gone further than it did. Some lessons, he said, cost more than money, and he'd gotten off cheaper than he might have. We finished our drinks, and Harold insisted on paying the tab, waving off my protest with the kind of old-school stubbornness that didn't allow for argument. Outside the bar, he shook my hand and said I should call him if I needed anything, that we were in this together whether we liked it or not. I drove back to my apartment feeling strange and unmoored, like the ground had shifted under my feet and I was still learning how to walk on the new terrain. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it that morning, but it felt different now, less like a crime scene and more like just a place where I temporarily lived. I started packing Sierra's remaining belongings into boxes, working methodically through drawers and closets, removing every trace of her from my space. The annulment paperwork came through 2 weeks later, Patricia Odom calling to tell me that the judge had granted it based on the bigamy evidence and that I was legally free of Sierra effective immediately. She also said that none of Sierra's debt could be attached to me since the marriage was void from the start, which meant the $40,000 in credit card charges was Sierra's problem and Sierra's alone. I felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I was carrying, the official confirmation that I could close this chapter and start writing a new one. Patricia asked if I wanted to pursue any civil damages against Sierra, and I told her I just wanted to be done, to never have to think about her or say her name or explain to anyone else what had happened. Work became my anchor, the routine of showing up and solving technical problems providing structure when everything else felt chaotic. Devin asked fewer questions as the weeks passed, sensing maybe that I was processing something I wasn't ready to talk about, and I appreciated the space he gave me. I started eating lunch alone in my truck instead of in the break room, just to have some quiet time to think, or not think, to let my mind settle into whatever it needed to settle into. One afternoon, I got a LinkedIn message from a recruiter asking if I'd be interested in interviewing for a senior IT position at a tech company downtown, better pay and benefits than my current job, and I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. The interview went better than expected, probably because I had nothing to lose and no one to impress except myself. The hiring manager was a woman in her late 30s named Keisha, who'd built the department from scratch and was looking for someone who could handle complex systems and work independently. We talked for an hour about everything from server architecture to how I handled stress, and by the end she was nodding and making notes that seemed positive. She said they'd be in touch within a week, and I left the building feeling something close to hopeful for the first time in months. The job offer came 3 days later, a $20,000 salary increase and the kind of professional challenge I'd been ready for but hadn't pursued, because Sierra had always had opinions about my career that made me doubt myself. I gave my 2 weeks' notice at the support center, and my supervisor congratulated me, said he'd seen this coming because I was too skilled for the work we were doing. Devin took me out for beers on my last day and told me he'd figured something major had happened in my personal life based on how I'd changed over the past few months, and I gave him the abbreviated version without all the painful details. He shook his head and said some people were just built wrong inside, and the best thing you could do was get clear and stay clear. We clinked bottles and talked about anything other than Sierra, and I went home that night feeling like maybe I was actually going to be all right. The text from an unknown number came at midnight. "You didn't have to destroy my life. I hope you're happy now." I blocked the number without responding and went to sleep. The new job demanded more of my attention and energy than the old one, which turned out to be exactly what I needed to stop dwelling on the past. Keisha ran her department with high expectations and clear communication, and I found myself working harder than I had in years just to keep up with the pace she set. My coworkers were mostly younger than me, tech-savvy millennials who'd grown up coding and treated computers like extensions of their own minds, but they accepted me without the hazing I'd expected. There was a woman on the team named Imani who handled network security and had a laugh that filled the whole office, and she took it upon herself to make sure I didn't eat lunch alone my first week. We'd grab food from the trucks that parked outside the building and sit in the plaza talking about everything from politics to sports to the best barbecue in Austin. Imani was the one who eventually asked about my relationship status, not in a flirty way but in the casual manner of someone making conversation and genuinely curious. I told her I'd recently gotten out of a marriage that had ended badly, and she nodded like she'd heard that story before and didn't need details unless I wanted to share them. She mentioned she'd been divorced herself about 5 years back, said it was the best decision she'd ever made, even though it had hurt like hell at the time. There was something comforting about talking to someone who understood that particular flavor of failure and hadn't let it define her whole life. We started having lunch together most days, and gradually I found myself opening up about Sierra in ways I hadn't with anyone except Harold and the lawyers. Harold called every couple of weeks to check in and update me on the legal proceedings, which were grinding forward with all the speed of continental drift. Sierra had pleaded not guilty to all charges, which meant there would be a trial, and her public defender was trying to negotiate a plea deal that would reduce her sentence. The district attorney wasn't interested in deals, Harold said, not with her record and the number of victims involved. His daughter Jennifer had stayed in Austin for 2 weeks helping him sort through the financial damage, and they'd managed to recover about half of what Sierra had taken by canceling credit cards and disputing charges. He sounded stronger on the phone than he had in person. Like having his family involved had reminded him he wasn't just a lonely widower waiting to be taken advantage of. 3 months into my new job, Keisha asked if I'd be interested in leading a major infrastructure upgrade project that would involve coordinating with multiple departments and external vendors. It was the kind of opportunity that could fast-track my career if I handled it well, or tank my reputation if I failed, and I said yes because I was tired of playing it safe. The project consumed my days and many of my evenings, but I didn't mind the long hours because going home to an empty apartment had lost its appeal. I'd started looking at houses to buy, small places in suburbs I could actually afford now that my salary had increased, thinking about putting down roots somewhere that didn't have Sierra's fingerprints all over it. Imani invited me to a birthday party for one of our co-workers, a casual thing at someone's house with beer and a grill, and people from work mixing with people from other parts of their lives. I almost said no out of habit, but something made me accept. Maybe just the need to prove to myself that I could still function in social settings. The party was exactly what she'd described, low-key and friendly, and I found myself actually enjoying conversations with strangers instead of counting the minutes until I could leave. There was a woman there named Alana who worked in marketing at a different company, and we ended up talking for over an hour about nothing in particular, just the easy flow of two people who found each other interesting. She had natural hair pulled back in a head wrap and eyes that crinkled when she smiled, and when the party wound down, she asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. I said yes before my brain could come up with reasons to say no, and we exchanged numbers like adults who'd done this dance before. Driving home that night, I felt something unfamiliar that took me a moment to identify as excitement, the kind of anticipation that comes before something potentially good instead of potentially catastrophic. Imani texted me the next day asking how it went with Alana, and I told her we were meeting for coffee on Saturday. She sent back a string of encouraging emojis and told me not to overthink it, advice I definitely needed because my tendency was to overthink everything until it was strangled to death. Coffee with Alana turned into lunch, which turned into walking around downtown for 3 hours talking about our lives in the way people do when they're testing whether there's something real worth pursuing. She'd been single for a year after ending a relationship that had run its course, and she was honest about not wanting to rush into anything serious but being open to seeing where things went. I appreciated that honesty, the lack of game playing or hidden agendas, and I told her about my situation with Sierra in broad strokes without dumping all the trauma on her. Alana listened and asked thoughtful questions and didn't run screaming, which I took as a good sign. We made plans to see each other again, and I left that first date feeling lighter than I had in months. The trial date for Sierra's case was set for 6 months out. Martinez called to inform me, and both Harold and I would likely be called to testify. I'd been dreading that inevitability, the prospect of facing her in a courtroom and having to recount publicly how thoroughly I'd been fooled. But sitting in my truck after coffee with Alana, watching her walk back to her car with a little wave, I realized Sierra didn't have the power over me she'd once had. She was just someone I used to know, someone who'd made terrible choices that were catching up with her, and I was someone who'd survived those choices and was building something new. That shift in perspective felt like stepping out of a shadow I hadn't noticed was there until the light changed. Alana and I fell into an easy rhythm over the next few weeks, seeing each other twice a week for dinners or movies or just driving around Austin talking. She was smart and funny and refreshingly direct, the kind of woman who said what she meant and expected you to do the same. I found myself wanting to be better around her, not in a performative way but in the genuine sense of rising to meet someone who had standards and wasn't afraid to enforce them. She met Imani for lunch one day and they got along immediately. which felt important even though I couldn't articulate exactly why. Having people in my life who knew each other and liked each other created a web of connection that made me feel anchored instead of adrift. The infrastructure project at work was going well, ahead of schedule and under budget, and Keisha pulled me aside to say she was impressed with how I'd handled the complexity. She asked if I'd be interested in applying for a team lead position that was opening up in the next quarter, and I told her I'd think about it. The old version of me would have said yes immediately, eager to please and prove myself, but I'd learned that some decisions deserved actual consideration. I talked to Alana about it over dinner, and she asked smart questions about what I actually wanted instead of what I thought I should want. That conversation helped me realize I did want the promotion, but on my own terms and for my own reasons, not to prove anything to anyone. Harold called with news that Sierra's lawyer had approached the DA with another plea offer, this time suggesting 5 years in exchange for guilty pleas on the fraud charges. The DA had countered with 8 years minimum, Harold said, and it was looking like Sierra might actually take it to avoid the risk of a longer sentence if she lost at trial. Part of me wanted her to get the maximum penalty, decades behind bars for all the lives she'd ruined, but another part just wanted it to be over so I could stop having her name come up in conversation. Harold said he felt the same way, torn between justice and closure, and we agreed that whatever happened would have to be enough. Alana asked about my marriage one evening when we were sitting on her balcony watching the sunset, and I gave her the full story this time, all the details I'd glossed over in our first conversation. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before saying that Sierra must have been deeply broken inside to do what she did. I'd never thought about it that way, had been too focused on my own pain to consider what kind of damage creates a person who lives like Sierra lived. Alana said hurt people, and while that didn't excuse Sierra's actions, it maybe explained them, and I realized she was right. Something in Sierra's past had twisted her into someone who could only see other people as resources to exploit, and that was its own kind of tragedy, even if I couldn't find it in myself to feel sorry for her. The plea deal fell through when Sierra decided at the last minute she wanted to go to trial, gambling that a jury might be sympathetic to a young woman who claimed she'd been manipulated by the older men she'd targeted. Her lawyer was spinning a narrative about survival and desperation, Martinez told us, trying to paint Sierra as a victim of circumstance rather than a calculated predator. The DA was confident the evidence would overcome any sympathy play, but trials were unpredictable and juries could be swayed by emotion over facts. I tried not to think about it too much, focusing instead on work and Alana and the slow construction of a life that felt stable and real. Amani organized a team happy hour after we successfully completed the infrastructure upgrade, and I brought Alana as my +1. Watching her interact with my co-workers, laughing at Keisha's stories and holding her own in technical conversation she had no background in, I felt something click into place that I'd been waiting for without knowing it. This was what normal looked like, what healthy looked like. Relationships built on honesty and mutual respect instead of deception and manipulation. We left the happy hour early and went back to her place, and for the first time since Sierra I felt completely present with someone instead of half-guarding myself against future betrayal. The trial started on a cold morning in January, the courthouse steps crowded with people heading to various proceedings. Harold and I met outside and went through security together, his daughter Jennifer with him for moral support. We sat in the gallery and watched Sierra's lawyer make his opening statement, painting her as a woman who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to have her life destroyed over them. The DA's opening was more direct. Sierra Lawson was a serial fraudster who preyed on vulnerable men, and the evidence would prove beyond reasonable doubt that she'd done so deliberately and without remorse. Sierra sat at the defense table looking smaller than I remembered, wearing a conservative dress and minimal makeup, every inch the reformed sinner her lawyer was trying to present. I was called to testify on the second day, and I walked to the witness stand feeling every eye in the courtroom on me. The DA walked me through the timeline of my relationship with Sierra, the discovery of her second marriage, the evidence I'd gathered, all of it laid out in clinical detail that somehow made it hurt less. Sierra's lawyer cross-examined me, trying to suggest I'd been controlling or suspicious or had driven her to seek comfort elsewhere, but I kept my answers short and factual and didn't take the bait. Looking at Sierra while I testified, I expected to feel anger or pain, but what I actually felt was indifference. She was just another person in a courtroom, and I was just another witness telling the truth. When I stepped down from the stand, Harold squeezed my shoulder and said I'd done well. Harold testified on the third day, his voice steady as he described how Sierra had pursued him through a church singles group, how she'd presented herself as a widow looking for companionship, how quickly she'd moved from dating to marriage. The DA showed the jury copies of the forged documents Sierra had signed claiming to be single, the bank statements showing cash withdrawals that started immediately after the wedding, the credit card charges for luxury items she'd bought and either kept or sold. Harold's daughter, Jennifer, sat in the front row crying quietly while her father recounted his humiliation, and I could see several jurors looking at Sierra with expressions that suggested her lawyer's sympathy strategy wasn't working. Sierra's lawyer tried to paint Harold as a wealthy man who'd showered her with gifts willingly, but Harold calmly explained the difference between giving and being stolen from. The prosecution called witnesses from Colorado and New Mexico, men Sierra had targeted in previous years with variations of the same scheme. They were all older, all widowed or divorced, all financially comfortable and emotionally vulnerable, and their stories had an eerie similarity that made the pattern undeniable. One man broke down on the stand describing how Sierra had convinced him his late wife would have wanted him to be happy again, using his grief as a weapon against him. Another detailed the loans he'd given her for fake business ventures and family emergencies, money that had disappeared along with Sierra when he'd started asking questions. The jury listened with increasing attention, and I watched Sierra's expression shift from carefully neutral to barely concealed frustration. The defense's case was thin, relying mainly on character witnesses who testified that Sierra had been kind to them or helpful in some minor way, as if that balanced the scales against systematic fraud. Sierra herself took the stand against her lawyer's advice, probably figuring she had nothing to lose, and proceeded to tell a story about growing up poor and desperate, and learning early that men would give you things if you made them feel special. She claimed she'd never intended to hurt anyone, had genuinely cared for all the men including me and Harold, and had gotten in over her head trying to maintain multiple relationships. The DA's cross-examination dismantled that narrative piece by piece, confronting her with her own text messages about marks and targets and how much can I get before I bail. I watched Sierra's composure crack under questioning, her voice rising and her answers becoming defensive, and I realized she'd genuinely believed she could charm her way out of this like she'd charmed her way into so many bank accounts. But courtrooms don't work like lonely men's hearts, and facts don't care about a pretty face or a sad story. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: fraud, identity theft, bigamy, conspiracy. Sierra's face went white, and she gripped the defense table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The judge set sentencing for 3 weeks out and remanded Sierra to custody, and I watched the bailiffs lead her away in handcuffs while her lawyer gathered his papers with the resigned air of someone who'd known this was coming. Harold and I left the courthouse together and stood on the steps in the January cold, not quite sure how to process the relief and hollowness that came with winning something we'd never wanted to fight for in the first place. Jennifer hugged her father and thanked me for helping bring Sierra to justice, and I nodded but didn't feel like a hero or even particularly vindicated. Mostly, I just felt tired, ready to put this whole chapter behind me and move forward with the life I was building. Harold invited me to dinner to celebrate, and I almost declined before remembering that this man had become something like a friend despite the circumstances, and friends showed up for each other. We ate at a steakhouse Harold liked, just the 3 of us, and the conversation carefully avoided Sierra except when Jennifer asked what I thought the sentence would be. I said the DA had mentioned 8 to 12 years as likely, given the multiple counts and Sierra's refusal to show remorse. Jennifer said that seemed fair, though nothing would give back the time and emotional energy her father had lost. Harold was quieter than usual, pushing his food around more than eating it, and when Jennifer excused herself to take a phone call, he admitted he'd expected to feel better about the verdict than he actually did. I understood that completely, the gap between theoretical justice and actual healing, and I told him we'd probably feel better once some time had passed, and we could look back at this as something that happened to us instead of something still happening. Alana had texted during the trial asking how it went, and I called her on the drive home to give her the update. She said she was proud of me for seeing it through and asked if I wanted company that evening. I said yes, and she came over with takeout and a willingness to just sit with me while I processed everything. We didn't talk much, just ate and watched a movie and existed in the same space, and that quiet companionship was exactly what I needed. She stayed over that night, and I woke up the next morning feeling like maybe I'd actually turned a corner, like the Sierra chapter was finally closing and the Alana chapter was beginning in earnest. Work became my refuge again. The team lead position officially offered and officially accepted with a salary bump that felt like validation of how far I'd come in less than a year. Keisha told me she'd advocated hard for my promotion because she believed in my ability to grow into the role, and I promised her I wouldn't let her down. Imani organized a small celebration in the break room with cake and terrible champagne, and my new team seemed genuinely happy to have me leading them. I'd gone from being the guy whose life was falling apart to the guy who had his act together, and while I knew that perception was somewhat superficial, it still felt good to be seen as competent and stable. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and I took a personal day to attend even though I wasn't required to be there. Harold was there with Jennifer, and several of the out-of-state victims had flown in to give impact statements about how Sierra's actions had affected their lives. The judge listened to each one with careful attention, and when it was time to pronounce sentence, she noted that Sierra had shown no genuine remorse and had continued to manipulate and deceive even during the trial. The sentence was 10 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 7, and Sierra's face crumpled when she heard the numbers. I felt a twinge of something that might have been pity if I looked at it closely, but mainly I felt relief that it was finally, definitively over. The weeks after the sentencing felt like emerging from underwater, colors brighter and sounds clearer, everything suddenly possible in a way it hadn't been when Sierra's case was hanging over my head. Alana and I started talking about the future in concrete terms instead of hypotheticals, discussing whether we saw this relationship going somewhere serious and what that might look like. She was careful not to push, aware that I was still healing from deep wounds, but also honest about wanting more than casual dating if we were going to keep investing time and emotion in each other. I appreciated that directness, the way she created space for me to be uncertain without making me feel pressured to have all the answers. I found a house in Cedar Park, a small 3-bedroom with a yard and a garage and enough distance from my old apartment that it felt like a fresh start. The mortgage was manageable on my new salary, and closing on the place gave me a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's validation. Alana helped me pack and move, along with Imani and a couple of guys from work, and we spent a Saturday hauling boxes and furniture while music played from someone's portable speaker. There was something deeply satisfying about filling empty rooms with my own choices. Furniture I'd picked out instead of compromising on, colors I actually liked instead of what Sierra had insisted would look better. This house was mine in a way nothing had been mine in years. Harold called to tell me he'd started dating again, a woman named Ruth he'd met through his daughter's recommendation. Ruth was a retired teacher, age-appropriate and fully vetted by Jennifer, and Harold sounded almost shy talking about her like a teenager with his first crush. I was genuinely happy for him, glad he wasn't letting Sierra's betrayal close him off from the possibility of companionship. He asked about Alana, and I told him things were getting serious, and he gave me advice about not rushing, but also not letting fear keep me from good things. It was strange getting relationship counsel from a man who'd been conned into bigamy, but Harold had a wisdom that came from having lived long enough to see patterns and recognize what mattered. The 1-year anniversary of the night I'd tracked Sierra's location and knocked on Harold's door passed without fanfare, Just another Tuesday in my new house with my new job and my new relationship. I marked it privately, thinking about how much had changed and how much of that change had been painful before it became positive. Alana noticed I was quieter than usual that evening and asked if I was all right, and I told her what day it was and what it meant. She listened and then said something that stuck with me. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us create space for the best things to arrive. I'd lost Sierra and gained Harold's friendship, Imani's mentorship, Keisha's faith in my abilities, and Alana herself. The math didn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it did make the outcome easier to accept. Work threw me a curveball when Keisha announced she was leaving for a VP position at another company and recommended me as her replacement for department head. The promotion would mean more responsibility and significantly more money, but also less hands-on technical work and more management and politics. I took a week to think about it, talking it through with Alana and Imani and even calling my mother for her perspective. My mother said she'd watched me grow more in the past year than in the previous 5 combined, and she trusted I'd make the right choice for myself. I accepted the position and immediately felt the weight of it, the awareness that I was now responsible for an entire team's success and well-being. Alana's lease was ending, and she'd been looking at apartments when I suggested she consider moving in with me instead. The words came out more casually than I felt, but her face lit up in a way that made my heart speed up. She said yes, but wanted us to talk about expectations and boundaries first, what living together would mean, and how we'd handle conflicts and money and all the practical details that sink relationships when people skip over them. We spent an evening mapping out those details, and I was struck by how different this felt from moving in with Sierra, how much clearer and safer and more intentional. Alana moved in on a Saturday in May, her books and records and plants filling spaces in my house that became our house with that simple shift in pronouns. Harold and Ruth invited us to dinner at his condo, and it was surreal sitting at the table where I'd first confronted the evidence of Sierra's double life, now eating Ruth's homemade lasagna and laughing about Ruth's grandchildren's antics. Jennifer joined us via video call from California, and she told Alana embarrassing stories about her father that made Harold blush and protest. The evening felt normal and warm and completely removed from the trauma that had brought Harold and me into each other's lives. Ruth knew the whole story but treated me with simple kindness instead of pity, and I liked her immediately for that. I got a call from Detective Martinez out of the blue, informing me that Sierra was appealing her conviction on procedural grounds and asking if I'd be willing to testify again if it came to that. The news hit me harder than I expected, the thought of having to relive everything in another courtroom, and I told Martinez I'd do what was necessary, but hoped it wouldn't come to that. Alana found me sitting on the back porch that evening, staring at nothing, and she sat beside me without speaking until I was ready to talk. I told her about the call and the appeal, and she took my hand and said we'd deal with it together if we had to, that I wasn't alone in this anymore. That simple statement of partnership meant more than she probably realized. The appeal was denied 3 months later, Sierra's lawyer having failed to demonstrate any actual procedural errors during the trial. Martinez called with the news, and I thanked him for keeping me informed, then hung up and felt something release in my chest that I'd been holding tight since the conviction. Alana made dinner that night, and we toasted with cheap wine to chapters that stay closed and futures that stay open. The next morning, I deleted every photo of Sierra from my phone and computer, removing the last visual traces of her from my life. It felt ceremonial and necessary, a final step in a process I'd been walking through for over a year. Work was demanding in the best way, the challenge of leading a department pushing me to develop skills I hadn't known I needed. I made mistakes and learned from them, hired well and fired when necessary, built a team culture that valued both excellence and humanity. Imani got promoted to Director of Security and became my peer instead of my friend who happened to work in the same building, and our relationship shifted to accommodate that change while maintaining its core. She and Alana became close friends independent of me, having girls' nights and inside jokes that I wasn't part of, and I loved that they had their own relationship instead of just being my girlfriend and my colleague who tolerated each other. Harold's health declined suddenly that fall. A heart attack that put him in the hospital for 2 weeks and scared Jennifer into moving back to Austin to be closer to him. Ruth called me when it happened, and I went to the hospital immediately, sitting with her in the waiting room until the doctors said Harold was stable. He looked smaller and frailer in the hospital bed, oxygen tubes in his nose and monitors beeping, but his eyes were clear when I took his hand and told him to stick around because we weren't done being friends yet. He smiled weakly and said he wasn't planning on going anywhere, had too much life left to live with Ruth to let some faulty arteries take him out. Jennifer and I bonded during those hospital vigils, talking about our respective relationships and careers and the strangeness of how her father and I had met. She said Harold talked about me often, was proud of how I'd rebuilt my life and grateful we'd found each other even though the circumstances had been terrible. I admitted I felt the same way, that Harold had become like a father figure or maybe an uncle, someone who cared about my well-being without needing anything from me in return. Jennifer said her actual father had been gone since she was young, and Harold had stepped into that role for her, and she was glad he had someone else who saw him that way. When Harold came home from the hospital, he was under strict orders to rest and reduce stress, and Ruth enforced those orders with gentle tyranny. Alana and I got engaged on a weekend trip to Fredericksburg. Nothing dramatic or public, just me asking while we were watching the sunset from a hillside and her saying yes while tears ran down her face. We'd talked about marriage in abstract terms before, both of us cautious given our histories, but sitting there with her, I knew I wanted to build a life that was legally and spiritually bound together. The ring was modest because I'd learned that value doesn't come from price tags, and she loved it because it represented thought and intention instead of guilt or obligation. We called our families that evening and got enthusiastic responses from everyone, my mother crying happy tears and saying she'd known Alana was the one from the first time I'd mentioned her name. Planning the wedding became a joint project that revealed how well we worked together, dividing tasks according to our strengths and compromising on the details that mattered to each of us. We decided on a small ceremony in Austin with just family and close friends, nothing elaborate or expensive, just a celebration of commitment that felt authentic to who we were. Harold and Ruth were invited, and Harold insisted he was well enough to attend. Wouldn't miss it for anything. Imani was Alana's maid of honor, and Devin from my old job agreed to stand up as my best man, the two of them representing different chapters of my life coming together. The wedding was perfect in its imperfection, an afternoon in March with good food and better company and vows we'd written ourselves. I promised Alana honesty and presence and the kind of love that shows up in actions, not just words, and she promised me patience and faith and partnership through whatever came next. Harold cried during the ceremony and blamed it on his medications, but Ruth smiled and patted his hand, and we all knew better. My mother danced with my stepfather and told everyone who would listen how proud she was of the man I'd become. Alana's family welcomed me with warmth and stories about her childhood that made her groan and me laugh. We left the reception early and went home to our house, our life, our future that felt solid and real and earned. The honeymoon was a week in New Mexico, just driving and hiking and being together without schedules or obligations. We talked about kids and whether we wanted them, about career goals and retirement dreams, about all the ordinary, extraordinary things that make up a shared life. Alana said she'd never felt safer with anyone than she felt with me, and I told her that safety was what I'd been looking for without knowing it, the knowledge that someone had your back without ulterior motives. We came back to Austin, rested and ready to start our married life in earnest, and I felt gratitude for the path that had led me here, even though parts of it had been brutal. 6 months into our marriage, Alana told me she was pregnant. We'd been trying casually, not tracking or stressing, but also not preventing, and the positive test felt like confirmation that we were moving in the right direction. I called Harold to tell him the news, and he congratulated me with such genuine joy that I had to blink back tears. He said he wished he could be around to watch the kid grow up, and I told him not to talk like that. He had years left in him. He laughed and said maybe so, but either way he was glad I'd have what he'd had with Jennifer and that particular kind of love that comes with being a parent. We talked for an hour about everything and nothing, and when we hung up I felt full of something that wasn't quite happiness but something deeper and more lasting. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the first trimester, Alana dealing with morning sickness and fatigue while I handled more of the housework and cooking. We told our families at Thanksgiving, gathering everyone together for the announcement, and the joy in the room was palpable and real. My mother started knitting immediately, producing tiny hats and booties at an alarming rate, and Alana's mother began planning a baby shower with military precision. Harold and Ruth came to dinner one evening, and Harold brought a stuffed elephant that had belonged to Jennifer when she was a baby, carefully preserved for decades in his storage unit. The gesture moved me more than I could express, this tangible link between generations and the family we'd chosen for ourselves. Work stabilized into a rhythm where I felt competent and challenged in equal measure, my team hitting targets and innovating solutions that got noticed by upper management. The company expanded, and I was asked to open a new office in San Antonio, overseeing the build-out and hiring while maintaining my current responsibilities in Austin. It meant more travel and longer hours, but Alana supported the opportunity, and we agreed I'd pull back once the baby came. I drove to San Antonio twice a week for 3 months, building a team from scratch and learning leadership skills that would have taken years to develop otherwise. The San Antonio office launched successfully, and I handed day-to-day operations to the manager I'd hired, returning to Austin full-time just as Alana entered her 3rd trimester. Harold's health continued its slow decline despite Ruth's best efforts to keep him active and engaged. He developed complications from the heart attack that required additional medications and regular doctor visits, and Jennifer moved him into her house so she could monitor him more closely. I visited weekly, bringing takeout and staying for dinner, and we'd sit in Jennifer's living room talking about old times and new developments. Harold wanted to know everything about the baby preparations, what names we were considering, whether we'd found out the gender, if the nursery was ready. He lived vicariously through my anticipation, and I realized he was using my future to distract himself from his fading present. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was in a meeting, Jennifer's name lighting up my phone screen in a way that immediately felt ominous. I excused myself and answered to hear her crying, barely coherent, saying Harold had collapsed and the paramedics were working on him, but it didn't look good. I left work immediately and drove to the hospital where Jennifer and Ruth were holding each other in the emergency room waiting area. A doctor came out 20 minutes later and told us they'd done everything they could, but Harold's heart had given out, and he was gone. The grief hit me like a physical force. This man who'd been a stranger 2 years ago and had become family, just gone, his chair at Jennifer's dinner table permanently empty. The funeral was well attended, Harold having lived long enough and well enough to accumulate friends and colleagues who wanted to pay respects. I gave a eulogy that focused on Harold's kindness and resilience, how he'd turned the worst experience of his later life into an unexpected friendship that had meant everything to me. Jennifer thanked me afterward, saying her father had talked about me constantly in his final months, proud of my success and grateful for our bond. Ruth was stoic through the service but crumbled at the graveside, and I held her while she cried for the man she'd only had a few years with. Alana stood beside me with her hand on my back, 7 months pregnant and radiating the kind of steady support that made me fall in love with her all over again. Processing Harold's death while preparing for new life felt cosmically unfair, the universe giving and taking in the same breath. I threw myself into finishing the nursery, painting walls and assembling furniture with an intensity that Alana recognized as grief management. She let me work through it physically while being present when I needed to talk, and I loved her for understanding that sometimes the best support is just proximity without expectation. Jennifer called one evening to say they'd been going through Harold's papers and found an envelope addressed to me, and I drove over to pick it up with my heart in my throat. The envelope contained a letter in Harold's shaky handwriting, dated a month before his death. He wrote about how meeting me had been one of the best things to happen in his final years, how our friendship had restored his faith in people after Sierra had shattered it. He said he was proud of the man I'd become and the family I was building, and he wished he could be around to meet my child, but knew he was running out of time. The letter ended with advice about fatherhood and marriage, practical wisdom earned through decades of living, and a request that I named the baby after him if it was a boy. I sat in my truck in Jennifer's driveway and cried harder than I had since the funeral, clutching that letter like a lifeline to a man I'd miss for the rest of my life. Alana went into labor 3 weeks later on a Sunday morning, contractions starting gentle and building to urgent over the course of 6 hours. I drove her to the hospital with her overnight bag and my barely controlled panic, and she laughed at me between contractions, saying I needed to calm down or I'd be useless. The labor was long and difficult, 18 hours of increasing intensity until our son finally arrived screaming and perfect. The nurse put him on Alana's chest, and I looked at this tiny human we'd created together, and everything else in the world fell away. We named him Harold Joshua, honoring the man who'd helped me understand what it meant to survive betrayal and build something better. Fatherhood was harder and more rewarding than anything I'd experienced. Sleepless nights and endless diapers balanced against the weight of my son in my arms and the sound of his laugh. Alana and I navigated the challenges together, dividing responsibilities and supporting each other through the exhaustion and adjustment. My mother visited for 2 weeks after the birth and was an absolute saint, cooking and cleaning and giving us breaks to sleep or shower or just sit together quietly. Jennifer came by regularly with casseroles and hand-me-down baby clothes from her grandchildren, maintaining the connection between our families that Harold had started. Work gave me paternity leave, and I took every day of it, learning my son's patterns and preferences, watching Alana transform into a mother with grace and humor. When I returned to the office, I struggled with the balance, wanting to be present for every moment at home while also maintaining the career momentum I'd built. Imani pulled me aside one day and told me that being a good father meant being present when I was home. Not perfect, and that advice helped me release some of the guilt I was carrying. I set boundaries around work hours and stuck to them, leaving the office at 5 regardless of what was pending and not checking email after dinner. The first year of Harold's life passed in a blur of milestones and memories, first smile and first tooth and first steps. Alana returned to work part-time, and we hired a nanny we both trusted, building a support system that let us both pursue careers without sacrificing family. Ruth became like a grandmother to Harold, babysitting when we needed date nights and spoiling him with the kind of love that comes from having too much of it to keep to yourself. She said it helped her feel close to her Harold, watching this baby who carried his name grow and thrive. I understood that completely, the way connections persist beyond death if we nurture them. Sierra's name came up one last time when I got a letter forwarded from my old apartment, postmarked from the prison where she was serving her sentence. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won out and I read the 3 handwritten pages she'd sent. The letter was part apology and part justification. Sierra claiming she'd been struggling with mental health issues she'd never addressed and had made terrible choices as a result. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know she regretted hurting me specifically, that I'd been kind to her and hadn't deserved what she'd done. The letter ended with congratulations on my marriage and child, information she'd apparently gotten from mutual acquaintances before going to prison, and a wish that I'd found the happiness she'd been too broken to give me. I read the letter twice and felt nothing except a distant kind of pity for the person she might have been if she'd made different choices. I showed it to Alana, and she asked if I wanted to respond, and I said no. There was nothing left to say that would change anything. I filed the letter away in a box of documents related to that whole period of my life, then went to check on Harold, who was napping in his crib. Looking at my son, sleeping peacefully, I understood that Sierra had done me a favor by destroying our relationship, creating space for this better life to exist. The thought didn't excuse her actions, but it did allow me to release the last threads of anger I'd been holding. The second year brought new challenges as Harold became mobile and opinionated, a tiny person with preferences and personality emerging daily. Alana and I bought a bigger house in a better school district, selling the Cedar Park place and moving to a neighborhood with other young families. The new house had a backyard where Harold could play and enough bedrooms for the second child we were starting to discuss. Work remained demanding but manageable. My team strong enough that I could delegate effectively and trust things would get done without my constant oversight. I mentored younger employees the way Keisha had mentored me, paying forward the investment someone had made in my potential. Jennifer started dating someone seriously, a widower she'd met through a grief support group, and their relationship moved quickly toward engagement and marriage. She asked if I'd walk her down the aisle since Harold wasn't there to do it, and I was honored and terrified in equal measure by the request. The wedding was lovely, Jennifer radiant and her new husband clearly devoted, and I fulfilled my duty without tripping or crying until the father-daughter dance when they played Harold's favorite song. Ruth caught my eye across the reception hall and raised her glass to me, and I raised mine back in acknowledgement of the man we both missed and the family he'd somehow created from the wreckage of Sierra's schemes. Alana got pregnant again when Harold was 2.5, this time with a girl who arrived quickly and easily compared to her brother's dramatic entrance. We named her Ruth Margaret, honoring both Ruth and Harold's late wife, and Ruth sobbed when we told her. Having 2 children shifted the family dynamic completely, our lives becoming controlled chaos that somehow worked because we worked together. I looked around our dinner table one evening, Alana feeding Ruth while trying to eat her own food, Harold covered in spaghetti sauce and laughing, and felt the kind of contentment that comes from building something real and lasting. This was what Sierra had stolen from me without realizing it. Not just a relationship, but the future that relationship could have created, and I was grateful every day that her betrayal had freed me to find this instead. The years accumulated like interest in a well-managed account, slow and steady growth that compounded into something substantial. Harold learned to read, and Ruth learned to walk, and Alana and I learned to be partners in the truest sense, supporting each other through career changes and family emergencies and the ordinary struggles of middle age. I got promoted to VP level, and Alana started her own marketing consultancy, both of us building careers that mattered while prioritizing the family we'd created. We traveled when we could, took the kids to see my mother in Houston and Alana's family in Dallas, created traditions and memories that would anchor our children the way we'd both wished we'd been anchored. Sierra was released on parole after serving 7 years, and I only knew because Martinez sent me a courtesy notification email. The message said she'd been a model prisoner and completed various rehabilitation programs, and her parole conditions prohibited her from contacting any of her victims. I read the email once and deleted it, then went to pick up my kids from school and didn't think about Sierra again for weeks. She was someone I used to know, a person who'd caused pain that had transformed into something better, and her release didn't change anything about my life. Alana asked if I wanted to talk about it, and I said there was nothing to talk about, which was true in a way I couldn't have imagined years ago when the wound was fresh and angry. The real test came 6 months later when I was having lunch at a restaurant downtown and saw Sierra walk in with a man who looked to be in his 40s, well-dressed and confident. She'd aged in prison, harder lines around her eyes and mouth, her beauty still present but dimmed somehow. Our eyes met across the restaurant and I saw recognition and fear flash across her face, like she expected me to make a scene or confront her. Instead, I just looked away and continued my conversation with the client I was meeting. Sierra and her companion, as irrelevant to my life as strangers passing on the street. I finished my lunch and paid my check and left without looking back, and the power in that indifference was more satisfying than any revenge I could have taken. Our son, Harold, turned 10, and our daughter, Ruth, turned 7, and Alana and I celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with a trip to Hawaii while my mother watched the kids. We renewed our vows on a beach at sunset. Simpler words than the first time, but deeper meaning, a decade of partnership and growth behind every promise. Alana told me that night that she'd never imagined this life when we first met, hadn't dared hope for something this stable and good. I understood completely because I'd spent years after Sierra expecting the other shoe to drop, waiting for betrayal or abandonment, until finally I'd internalized that Alana was different and this life was real. Trust earned slowly is trust that lasts, and we'd built ours brick by brick over years of showing up for each other. Work sent me to a conference in Denver, and I had a free evening, so I looked up the address of the church where Harold's late wife, Margaret, was buried. I drove to the cemetery and found her grave next to the plot where Harold now rested, their headstones side by side after being apart for years. I stood there and told them both about my life, about their granddaughter Ruth, who had Margaret's smile, and their grandson, Harold, who had his namesake's kindness. I told them about Jennifer's happiness and Ruth's resilience and the family that had somehow formed from the ashes of Sierra's destruction. The conversation was one-sided and probably ridiculous, but it felt important to close that circle, to acknowledge that their lives had touched mine in ways they'd never know. Jennifer called a few months later to say she was moving to Oregon for her husband's job, and we both cried on the phone about the distance even though we knew it was the right choice for her family. We promised to visit each other regularly and stay in close touch, and we mostly kept those promises even though life got in the way sometimes. The connection between us remained strong because it was forged in shared trauma and maintained through genuine affection, and geography couldn't erase that. Ruth, the elder, went with them, still vibrant at 78, and I made sure my kids knew their honorary grandmother even from a distance. The tech industry evolved and my career evolved with it, pivoting from infrastructure to emerging technologies, keeping myself relevant and challenged. I mentored dozens of younger employees over the years, watching some succeed spectacularly and others flame out, trying to give each of them the kind of support Keisha had given me. Amani and I stayed close friends despite both of us being too busy for regular contact, the kind of friendship that picks up exactly where it left off whenever we managed to grab lunch. She never married, but built a life full of godchildren and friends and professional achievements, and I admired her for knowing what she wanted and not apologizing for it. My mother passed away peacefully in her sleep at 81, and I grieved her loss while being grateful she'd lived long enough to know my children and see me happy. The funeral was well attended, my stepfather dignified in his sorrow, and I gave a eulogy about the sacrifices she'd made raising me alone and the wisdom she'd shared in her final years. Harold and Ruth met cousins they barely knew and learned family stories I'd never told them, connecting with roots I'd neglected during my years with Sierra. Driving home from Houston after settling my mother's affairs, I thought about legacy and what we leave behind, the way our choices ripple forward through generations whether we intend them to or not. Alana and I talked seriously about retirement as we approached 50, calculating whether we could afford to step back from full-time work and focus on travel and grandchildren and all the dreams we'd deferred while building careers. The math worked if we were careful, both of us having saved and invested wisely, and we made plans to transition to consulting work that would give us flexibility without completely abandoning our professional identities. Our son, Harold, was in college studying computer science, and our daughter Ruth was in high school excelling at everything she touched. Both of them were launched and thriving in ways that made me proud and slightly terrified of their futures. I thought about Sierra occasionally, wondering if she'd managed to build something legitimate after prison or if she'd fallen back into old patterns. I never looked her up or tried to find out, accepting that some questions don't need answers and some chapters need to stay closed. The man I'd been when I first knocked on Harold's door felt like someone I'd known a long time ago, younger and more naive and carrying wounds that had since healed into scars. Those scars reminded me where I'd been without defining where I was going, and that balance felt right and earned. The life I'd built with Alana wasn't perfect because perfect doesn't exist outside of fantasies, but it was real and solid and ours. We fought sometimes and made up, struggled with money and health and all the ordinary crises that fill a shared life, but we faced everything together with honesty and commitment. The betrayal that had almost destroyed me had instead taught me what I actually needed, and I'd found it with a woman who chose me every day just as I chose her. Harold Westbrook's friendship had shown me that family can be found in unexpected places, and Jennifer's continued presence in my life proved that chosen bonds can be as strong as blood. Sierra's name came up one final time when Ruth asked me about my first marriage while doing a family tree project for school, and I told her the truth in age-appropriate terms. Sometimes people aren't who they pretend to be, and the important thing is learning from the experience and not letting it make you bitter. Ruth nodded thoughtfully and wrote, "divorced," on her chart, and that single word summed up an entire era of my life with efficient accuracy. Standing in my backyard, watching Alana and our daughter, Ruth, plant tomatoes, while our son, Harold, mowed the lawn with more enthusiasm than skill, I felt the kind of bone-deep satisfaction that comes from surviving something terrible and building something good. The revenge Sierra had earned was this: my thriving, my happiness, my family, all of it existing because she'd failed to destroy me. She'd taken 2 years of my life and given me the motivation to make the next 40 years count. And in the end, that was the best outcome I could have asked for. The sun was setting over our neighborhood, casting long shadows across the grass, and I stood there grateful for second chances and fresh starts and the stubborn human capacity to heal and grow and love again despite every reason not to. What would you have done in Josh's place? Leave your comment, like this video, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you want another powerful story, click on the video appearing to your left.